Right, so I'm standing just outside of the Central Methodist Mission here on Greenmarket Square. You can see it here. And I'm standing in front of this banner that reads, "Jesus was the first to decriminalize sex work." And I posted a picture of this on my Facebook feed and asked the folks that I know what did they think about this particular banner and the interpretation of John chapter 8 verse 7. And I got a lot of very interesting comments, and we're going to try and discuss that, both the purpose and intention of the banner, but also how people responded to the interpretation of this verse. So first, a little bit about the Central Methodist Mission. You can see behind me here two other public boards. First of all, this one here, "You are born in love, by love and for love." And then just behind me here, their statement of intent. The Central Methodist Mission is a city church which is committed to Jesus Christ. We have been called out of division into community and seek to bring wholeness to each other and the world. And we can see already from this particular statement that this church sees itself as a church in the city, committed to the person and work of Christ, but doing it in a way which other churches may not necessarily do, because of their social location, but also because of their theology. And that's what makes this particular banner so interesting. A church in which there probably are sex workers working just around here, people procuring those services, the gap between the wealthy and those who are on the margins of the formal economy. And the church trying to figure out, how do we minister into this particular context? What would Jesus do in a context like this? Okay, so to come back to the banner, Jesus was the first to decriminalize sex work, and the quotation from John chapter 8 verse 7, where Jesus comes to the woman who is found to be in an adulterous relationship with a man who probably also by virtue of that would have been in an adulterous relationship. And he says to the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, the religious scholars and the legal authorities of the day, "Let the one who is without sin cast the first stone." And so the interpretation that I read here is, in this prophetic act, what this church is trying to do is they're trying to create a conversation around the issue of who has power in society, how that power is distributed, and who suffers most when power is used in ways that continually excludes those who are disempowered by different forms of social exclusion. I'll put a link to the Facebook thread on my Facebook page, where people have been commenting. This morning there were already over 100 comments, and people taking up what seemed to be very different and polarized views on this particular issue. For some of the persons, there was a clear sense that Jesus would never have condoned sin. Now, the question that I ask in that regard is, if that is true, who decides what is most sinful? Many of them seem to assume that the woman who was engaged in sex work, and that, even that's debatable. A New Testament scholar commented on there to say, of course, it wasn't sex work in the modern sense that she was receiving payment for sexual services, but certainly in the culture and time of Jesus, where women had very few rights unless they were accorded by men, she probably was seeking some form of social security, some form of access to economic well-being, perhaps for herself and her family. And so in that sense, one could say that it was a form of economic sex work, a form of what some may call prostitution. Now the question is, who was the sinner in that instance? Some have argued, and I think that certainly is the perspective of this church, that the sin that is being committed here is the sin of the state. In other words, the state is propagating a law which takes a person who is already on the fringes of society, needing to use their body to sustain themselves economically, and because they're criminalizing sex work, persons who are engaged in sex work find themselves doubly prejudiced. So not only are they having to use their bodies for sex work in order to earn money, but they have no legal protection under the state because they are criminalized. And so if, for example, someone refuses to pay them, or they get beaten up by a client or abused, the question is, what protection can they get from the state? And I think what this banner is trying to do is prophetically, it's inviting a conversation around what is criminal and not criminal. Now, I'm standing in a very busy intersection here. You can see I'm in a stop street, so there are cars all around, so if I need to move, forgive me. But it would seem that for many of the people who commented on the post, they tended to be polarized by this notion of social morality. What is socially acceptable in relation to sex work? Very few of them seem to remember that sex work doesn't thrive only because of sex workers. It thrives because of persons who pay people money for sex. And I wonder what that might mean in terms of justice, because I can tell you certainly from what I think I know about this field, the people who are paying the money have very many protections under the law. And I wonder what Jesus would have said about that. You know, my sense is that for very many of the people who were talking about the interpretation of this verse, John chapter 8 verse 7, they were quoting John chapter 8 verse 11 to say that's the way in which we should interpret it. Jesus said to the woman, "Now go and sin no more." But very few of them seem to pick up on the fact that in John's gospel, the whole of John's narrative is about those who are inside, yet they are portrayed as outsiders, and those who think that they are on the inside, and yet they find them outside of God's grace and law, the children of darkness and the children of light. And I think in that narrative in John's gospel, what Jesus is highlighting is the fact that those who have power and authority often use that power and authority to suit themselves. They've created a form of social imaginary, a way of thinking about the world that benefits those who are wealthy and those who are powerful. What Cornel West calls the golden rule. In other words, those who have the gold will rule. And I think in this section, this church is trying to question that. It's asking, would Jesus have been on the side of law and power, or would he have been on the side of justice? Now think about this. Not everything that is legal is just, and not everything that is illegal is unjust. Perhaps one of the clearest examples I give of this to my students is to say, during the apartheid era, when many of us were engaged in criminal activities to try and destabilize the state, we were doing something which we believed was just, even though it was criminal. And the state had laws which separated people according to their race, and even though it was legal, we would argue that it was unjust. And so the interpretation of this verse calls us as Christians to think again, what is the relationship between the law and justice? Okay, so it would seem to me that there are at least two things at play here. The one is what I call the social imaginary of the society in which we live. And of course, that comes from Charles Taylor's work. And he shows us that every society has this imaginative construction of what is real and what is good and what is right. And we need to remember that laws in themselves are only an expression, a formalization in policy of the social imaginary of a society. And certainly in our society, we could probably then say that we have laws that do not protect the most vulnerable and the most needy. Certainly in this instance, that might be the case. The second issue which this highlights is the complexity of biblical hermeneutics. Many people would proof text this and say, well, John chapter 8 verse 7 doesn't say that Jesus decriminalized sex work. Number one, was it sex work he was talking about? Number two, did he say that it was not criminal? And of course the issue here is that we need to remember that in hermeneutics the genre matters as much as the content. Now if you think about it, what was this church trying to do? In a banner like this, they are not wanting to offer a socio-historical exegetical translation of a biblical passage. This is a prophetic act. What they are wanting to do is to place something on the outside of their church that calls people to have a conversation about what is just and what is right. And I would encourage you to remember that every single interpretation of the biblical text is hermeneutically laden. We come at the text from our maleness and our femaleness, from our whiteness or blackness, from our privilege or from being excluded from the center of the economy. And each of us reads the text in that way. We find in it meaning and comfort and encouragement. So I would love to hear what your particular views are on this statement here. John chapter 8 verse 7, that Jesus was the first to decriminalize sex work. And I want to encourage you to keep those two things in mind. First of all, the social imaginary. Just because it's law, is it just? And secondly, the importance of hermeneutics. When you interpret the text, from what perspective are you interpreting it? Are you interpreting it as a highly educated biblical scholar? Are you looking very much at the socio-historical and socio-cultural interpretation? Are you interpreting it as someone who is a biblical literalist, who believes that every word must be treated exactly as it's written? Do you come from a middle class or a upper middle class, or from an economically excluded community? Are you male? Are you female? Have you ever used sex services? Or have you ever been a sex worker? Because I think all of those things will change how you interpret this particular text. Right, so after the end of all of this, we are now at the end, and I just want to encourage you again that remember, the intention here is to open up topics with which you can engage, and this is not a lecture, it's just a thought. I don't think we'd be able to solve the complexity of a legal and a hermeneutic issue, to deal with the passion of engaging the biblical text in one little 10-minute video. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. You can connect with me on Twitter @DigitalDion, on my website dionforster.com. Please subscribe, please share this video. You don't have to agree with me, you don't have to agree with these folks. All of the opinions are valuable, they matter, and so please leave a comment in the show notes, and I'd love to connect with you. So thanks for watching.